right? Yes. So we have our own homegrown IaaS, and this IaaS is specially designed for the needs of the academics. So we know the needs of the academics are different from the needs of the industry. How they are actually different, this you will see later. So this IaaS, this is the project, this is named Badal, and this is open source. So what actually is the motivation behind developing this IaaS, which is platform Badal, which we have developed? So as we have seen in one of the previous talks, that there are acute shortage of computers in our academic institutions, right? So this project Badal specially targets towards that problem. So like in most institutes, we have many more students than there are computers, right? And what happens that during the time of lab or some course or some practical work, more than one student share a computer, and it might even be possible that at one particular time slot somebody is doing C++, then that lab is over, someone else is doing Java on the same machine, then someone else is doing MATLAB on the same machine. What happens? Machine just cannot respond to all that kind of workload. Plus, if the machine is shared with so many students, many other problems arises. Like someone was working in some program and then he or she left, then some other person came and used that machine, she might even have tampered with the program. It is a fairly common thing. And there are other problems also, like the labs are shared for many different purposes. Like there's an, let us say program is going like this conference or some campus interview. So these days what companies do, they take online examinations and they use the labs, college labs for that purposes. So when the campus recruitment online tests are given, companies usually have a policy that every machine should be swiped clean. Nothing should be there, so they should be swiped clean. So what happens? All the programs that were there, gone. All the configuration that were there, gone. If some student was working on a project, they might have been running some specialized server or special software tools, gone. Everything is gone. So these are the problems which are faced. So our project especially caters towards these problems. And also in most institutes what we have, labs are closed after 5 o'clock, right? So this is again a problem. Like if the students want to work at night, he or she does not have the access. So this is another problem which we can solve. And in general we have all the benefits of a cloud. You might be knowing. What are the benefits? Like ease of maintenance, cost saving, power saving, efficient use of memory and CPU resources, and all those things. And the general benefits of a VM or a physical machine. For a VM you can restore, you can create snapshots, and all those things are possible which are not possible with actual real machines. So these are the benefits. To take the advantage of all these things, we create this platform Badal. So what actually makes it different from other services like Amazon, EC2 or AWS? This is specially catered for the needs of academic. Now what actually those needs are? So in an academic environment, we know there are some users, there are some types of users, there are some entities. Those entities like courses and projects. There might be some courses on programming in Python or programming in C. Some students might be working on that particular course, or some student might be taking that course. Some particular group of students might be taking a course, or they might be working in a particular project. So these are our entities which are taken into picture in our project Badal. And also we have different type of users, like students. Of course, students are the primary users, and instructors or the faculties, and of course there is a admin. So the workflow is very simple. In this workflow, every student and faculty has their own LDAP account. Most academic institutes have their own LDAP. If they don't have, our Badal provides easy steps to create their own LDAP settings. So users and faculty accounts are stored in LDAP. Every user can then log in using their account. They get a GUI From that GUI, student can request a virtual machine. When they request a virtual machine, they need to specify a few things like the name of the virtual machine, the amount of RAM that they require, the amount of CPU that they require, and the one thing in our Badal platform, which is different from other platforms, is that we give full control of how much RAM and CPU do you want. If someone wants 512 MB, they can get 512 MB RAM. If they want 1 GB, they can get 1 GB. But if they want 513 MB, they can get that. We get full control. Likewise for the CPU. If they want how many cores of CPU, they can specify and they will get just that. Also, they will specify the entity like course or the project. So for every course or every project, we have a notion of security group. Now what is the security group? The security group is a method to logically isolate and connect virtual machines in a network. For example, all the machines which are in a security group for, let us say, some course C programming, so all these machines will be connected to each other, and machines which are in other security group, they will not be connected to each other. What I mean by connected, even if they are running on the same physical host, and if they belong to different virtual machines, different security groups, they will not be able to reach each other. They will be isolated at the network level. So the concept of security group provides isolation at the network level. So a user, student, submits request with these parameters, which we just said. Also, he or she mentions the name of the request approver. So who will be the approver? For example, if they are working in a project, the project leader, the faculty under whom they are working in the project, that person will become the approver. Or if they are taking a course, then the person who instructs that particular course, that will become the approver. So the request, once filed by the students, the mail goes to the particular approver. Okay. Then approver, when logs into the Badal interface, he or she can see what all requests are pending for his or her approval. He and she can then approve the request based on the configuration which user has requested. I mean, some particular projects may need higher levels of configuration, some other may need low configuration. So the admin, the instructor, knows which particular course needs what kind of resources, and based on that he or she can approve. He or she also has the privilege to edit the request and then approve. So if some user has, let us say, requested 32 GB of RAM, and the approver knows that this amount of RAM is not actually required, so he or she can reduce or change the RAM configuration, anything, and then approve. One more thing which a requester has to specify is whether or not they need a public IP. So what do you mean by public IP? IP which is accessible throughout the LAN, public or floating IP. So this is also a part of the request. He or she can specify whether or not they need a public IP. And all these things can be edited by the approver. After the instructor has approved this particular request goes to the admin, the Badal admin, the main person who controls all the Badal working. Admin again has the right to do all those things like change the configuration. Admin also has the right to approve a request which has not been actually approved by the instructor. So this is a special case. I mean, this is not a part of the standard workflow. In standard workflow, what will happen? The student will make a request, then it will be approved by the instructor, and then it will be approved by the admin. But in some cases, it might be required that the student has made the request and the approver, the instructor might not be available or something like that. So the admin can directly approve the request. So this workflow is what distinguishes it from all other cloud services, and this workflow is why we call it an academic cloud, because this workflow is especially designed for the needs of an academic institution. So the technologies that we have used, primarily we have all used only the open source technologies like Ubuntu. We use Ubuntu for our servers. Then libvirt. Do any of you have any experience or knowledge about virtualization or hypervisors or things like that? So you might be knowing libot. What is libot? Libot is an actually API which interacts with multiple hypervisors. So the hypervisor which we use is KVM, but since we are using libot, and libot can deal with other hypervisors like one that of VMware and then Xen. So any of these hypervisor can be used because we use libot. Then we use for networking OpenVSwitch, and Python is we use for developing, and there are several other things which we use like Apache for our providing the servers, HA proxy, then DNS mask, then IP tables for implementing all those security rules, IP DNS mask for our DHCP and all those things, DNS services like that. So features, we have all the general features like user can request. When they request and their VM is created, they are notified by the means of an email. So they get an email. In that email, they get credentials. What their credentials will be. They get the IP address which is logged to their VM, so they can log in using their IP address and the credentials. And from the GUI itself, they can, when they log in, they will get a list of all the virtual machines which they own or which has been shared with them. We also have a notion of sharing virtual machines between different users. So when they log in, they will get the list of all the virtual machines which they either own or which has been shared with them. And when they log in, they can start a virtual machine, stop, pause, resume, take snapshot, then clone. Cloning is something which is again goes through the approval. Like if a user wants to clone his machine, they will make a request to clone, and it will again go through the approval. For start, stop, pause, resume, of course there are no approvals, but for taking a clone, there is approval. Then they can also request virtual disks, and they can also request public IP. So these things that they can specify when they are creating the VM, and even if they have already created VM, they can change all this configuration. And any change in configuration, like change in disk, extra storage, or CPU or RAM, or request for public IP, these things will again go through the approval. Apart from these, we have some extended features. These are the features which are not commonly provided by other infrastructure services. Like we have scheduled snapshots. So a user can specify that every Monday at this time, take a snapshot of my VM. So we have scheduled snapshots, and we have live migrations. Okay, other services also provide live migrations. We have live migrations to load balance. We have automatic live migrations for load balancing. For example, we have one host which are running some number of virtual machines, and there is another host which is running another number of virtual machines, and in this particular host we see that load is actually increasing, and this particular host is actually free. So we have our own schedulers and algorithms running behind, and we will do automatic live migrations. User will not even know about this. And we even have this notion for load balancing of network. For example, in this particular host I have a virtual machine running, and this particular host I have another virtual machine running, and it turns out that they are sharing too much data. There is a lot of data communication going between them. So we have our scheduler running, and we have our own algorithm. What it will do, it will find out which virtual machine to migrate to which particular host. So if there is too much data sharing on between them, instead of going through the network and choking down the network, what we can do, we can bring both the virtual machine in the same host. So all the overheads on the network will be reduced. And of course, like I have already said, we have the notion of sharing virtual machine between multiple users. Again, this thing is not available in most other services. And we have multi-tenancy with network level isolation, and we also have performance monitoring. By performance monitoring, we monitor the CPU usage, the RAM usage, the network bandwidth usage for each virtual machine, and for each compute host, the host in which their virtual machines are running. So we monitor all these aspects for every single virtual machine and the physical hosts. So this project was actually started in 2010. So it is already an old project. and this project is funded by MHRD. And so since 2010 the development started, and it has been fully functional since 2013. So since 2013 it has been deployed at various locations. So we have current major users, and of course the first user are we itself, IIT Delhi. At IIT Delhi we have two installations of Badal. We have one installation at the CSE department and one installation at the center. The CSE department is what we manage directly, and this installation is what which gets the frequent updates and all those things, and the one which is managed at the center, it gets updates late. So we have two different installations at IIT Delhi, and at IIT Delhi we have 5 blade servers. So at CSE installation we have 5 blade server, each server having 128 GB of RAM, and then we have 6 blade servers with 32 GB of RAM, and we have 10 Gbps of Ethernet backbone and 5 TB of virtualized storage. So this one is for the installation which we have at IIT Delhi CSE center. Then at the center level we have even bigger installation, and we have other users also like IIT Mumbai. They conduct online, like we saw in previous presentation. They conduct online training courses, and they call it MOOC, massively online open courseware. So for those open courseware they use our Badal servers. Other than that, NIC uses Badal servers for different purposes, and we have Dayal Bagh University. So the NIC installation is actually shared by various different institutes. Like most institutes, they don't have their own setup of Badal, but they use services from NIC. Some research projects from Jamia Millia are running at the centers at the NIC. Then D2 also uses for some of their student projects the setup which we have at NIC. Other than that, there is Dayal Bagh University at Agra. So it is also our user. AView. Has anyone of you heard about AView? AView is another project developed by Amrita University. Do you know Amrita University? Amrita University at Kerala. So AView is a project developed by Amrita University. It is specially designed for conducting all those online training courses and all those things. So all those classes which they conduct using their software AU, for the server requirements they depend on Badal. Then NMICT, that is National Mission on Education through ICT. For Brihaspati is another project developed by IIT Kanpur. It is a content delivery tool for delivering e-learning content. So this project again uses Badal servers. Then InflibNet is another project by Indian government. So all these projects which I have mentioned, most of them are the projects by Indian government. And InflibNet is another project which InflibNet actually stands for Information and Library Network. InflibNet, Information and Library Network, and it aims at connecting all the major libraries across the country. So this project is already running, and there are more than 250 libraries already connected using InflibNet. And for their server needs, again InflibNet again uses Badal. So what we are going next in our Badal. So as we see in current installation, we do everything manually. Like for dealing with hypervisor, we use Libot and we have our own code. For providing DHCP services, we run our own servers. For providing security, we have our own IP tables rule. Then we have our own SDN using Open vSwitch and other technologies. So what we are planning to do next is porting our setup to Badal. To OpenStack. So I don't know if you know about OpenStack. OpenStack is another cloud-based service, and it is an open source software. So Suppose if you want to cloud-based servers, so what you can do for industries, like most industries run their servers on Amazon, right? Most industries, like for example Snapdeal. Snapdeal runs their servers on Amazon. And what Snapdeal is currently trying to do, they are trying to build their own cloud using OpenStack. And why they are trying to do it? Because of course Snapdeal is a competitor of Amazon itself. So they don't want their data to be on their servers. So OpenStack is a open source software which can help you build your own cloud. Right? So what we are trying to do, we are creating new edition of Badal. We are building this on top of OpenStack. So one might ask, okay, we already have our Badal running, and why do you want to rebuild on top of OpenStack? So can anyone guess why do you want to build it on top of OpenStack? Okay, reason is very simple. This Badal has been developed totally by us. So if you want any new features, most probably what will happen, we will do it ourselves. Okay, there's a lot of things going on in the cloud infrastructure in OpenStack, and if you want to take the benefit of all the development work which has been going on in this community, it makes good sense to port it over to OpenStack, and that's what we are trying to do. But making OpenStack and building an OpenStack cloud is not actually an easy thing, and there are companies which exist only because installing OpenStack is difficult. The only service they provide is deployment of OpenStack. I mean, there are several companies which exist only because of this fact, that installing OpenStack is difficult. And why it is difficult? Because there are simply too many pieces. Like, you can think of it as building a car. So to build a car, you have to take together all the components like steering wheel, like wheels and seats and headlights and tail lamps and windshield and door handles and all those things. So not just that we have all these components which need to be put together. The problem is that for all these components you have several options. You can use this type of wheel, or for that if you have some other needs, you can use that other type of wheel. For headlights you have 3 other type of options. For tail lamp you have 4 other types of options, and it is really tedious task to figure out what exactly do you need. This is a tedious task. And if an academic institution today decides, okay, we'll have our own cloud on top of OpenStack, what they need to do? They need to figure out all those things by themselves. So what we have done, we have figured them out for them. We have done this thing. So if any academic institutes want to set up their own cloud, they don't need to figure out what components they need. We have figured it out from them. And we have even automated, this thing is ongoing. We will automate the installation of OpenStack to the farthest extent possible. So for any academic institute, it will be very easy to set up their own cloud. And next thing in OpenStack is the support for containers. So I don't know, how many of you know containers? Okay. So containers, informally they are called as lightweight virtual machines, though it is not very technically correct, but you can think of it like that for now. So they are like a lightweight virtual machine. If you want to suppose if you want to run an application in a virtual machine, what do you need? You need virtualized hardware, CPU, RAM, and on top of that you will run an entire operating system, and on top of that what you will do, you will run your particular application which you want to run. So what you want to actually run is that particular small application, but as an overhead you have running entire hypervisor and entire operating system, right? So containers eliminate the need for all those things. So containers provide an environment in which you can run your own applications without the need of running an entire operating system. You can run your own application without running entire operating system. So that's why they are called lightweight operating system, VMs. So we are providing support for containers. So in an academic institute, what this will do, for example, let us say some particular group of students or some particular people are working in a project which involves MATLAB. So they don't need to install and configure MATLAB. What they can do, they can request a container. all they need to do from the logging from the GUI and request a container from MATLAB, and we will give them a container. We will attach a container of MATLAB to their virtual machines. So within a few minutes, they will have MATLAB running on their virtual machine. So MATLAB is just an example. For example, let us say you are running any particular complicated system, so you don't need to reinstall it and configure it and all those things. No, these things are not required. All you need to do is request the particular containers, and you will get it in no time. So these things are in our pipeline. We are doing this, implementing the support for containers, and like I've said, we will ease up and automate the cloud building for academic institutions. So once this thing is done, it will be really easy for academic institutes to run and have their own clouds, and this is what actually we are trying to do. And another thing which we want to do in future is to translate Badal into various Indian languages. So this is it. Once this is done, hopefully the problem which most of the students face, I don't know how many, I mean, we all have been students at some point of time, and most of us might have faced that problem, lack of infrastructure at our college institutes. I mean, there are only few institutes which have ample infrastructure, which provide 24/7 lab access and all those things, but in most cases that is not available. So hopefully we will be able to solve that problem. This is what we are trying to do. Thank you. And I will also like to thank all the awesome people behind all these projects. We should give a big hand of applause for all the people behind this. Thank you.
These things are done manually.
Yeah, of course.
So how does this thing scale when the requests are logged?
Web application using Django, Tornado and Soft.js, and it's by Mayank Jain. Mayank is a backend developer at Fuel, and he's just a lead coder, and he spends all day on like JavaScript, HTML, basically a full stack guy. And previously has worked as a software developer in Utrix, Solutions of Financial Trading Technology startup in Chandigarh, and currently a software engineer at Fuel. So, man.
So my topic for today's talk is real-time web application. So let's start with it. I think Aniket have already introduced me. So I am currently working as a software developer in Fuel, and previously I have worked in Utrade Solution, a financial trading startup in Chandigarh. So in that company I have built this app, and some of more apps based on this architecture. So let's start with it. So in this talk, this is what I am going to cover. What is a real-time application? Why we need a real-time application? The criteria for choosing the tools for the app, the basic architecture, and some sample code and demo of the application. So I'm not going deep in the basics of Django and Python, so I assume you guys know basics of it. So the first question comes is, what is a real-time app? Anyone? Right. Most of the people confuse a real-time with the asynchronous app. So there is a difference between asynchronous and a real-time application. So asynchronous is executing a task without getting a response right at the time, and the task is executing behind right now. But real-time application, you see that on a server event, server automatically pushes the data to the browser. Like you must have seen Twitter, Facebook, you all receive the notification as soon as someone likes your picture or likes your tweet. So you don't have to refresh your notification feed or your web page to get that all the notification. Server automatically pushes that to the browser as soon as someone likes your pic, something like that. So upon an event, the server is supposed to push data, enabling the two-way communication is real-time application. And the most famous example I have already told, Facebook, Twitter for notifications, and chat also. Chat is also a real-time app. So whenever someone sends you a message, you will same time you will receive that message in your chat. So why we need a real-time application? So the basics are, it will increase the user experience. Like you don't want to refresh your notification feed by yourself to check if someone have liked your pic or any notification have arrived or not. So it will always it will increase the user experience, show you live data, make your web app like native applications in phones or tablets you use. So when I was building this application, these are the criteria that I followed to choosing the tools to create this app. The first one is to use WebSockets, but it should also have fallbacks. Like it should support IE6, IE7, because I have to make this app for the trading company, and most of their clients use IE7 till now. So and those web browser doesn't support WebSockets. Some of them use Comet, some of them long polling or something. So I have my application should have fallback for all the browsers. It should be usable with Python or Django, because that architecture I am building, it should be connectable to any Python Django application, so I can hook it easily with any app, and it should not require a lot of change in my current code. So this is the basic architecture that I followed. As you might have, as you are seeing, I am using a ZMQ that I'll be coming in a few minutes. What is ZMQ is? So we can use any third-party application to send the data to the browser. Like in my application, the stock exchange and some other API sends the real-time data to my application that I need to show on the browser. So I get all the data from third-party API, but you can also push data through Django, or if you have a Celery worker running any background task, you can also push that data to ZMQ through Celery, and Tornado is the server that will be listening to the ZMQ and gets the data and push it to the browser using the Sock.js library. Lots of applications currently libraries that we can use to make this real-time application. The first one is Django SSE. Django SSE is a Django server socket event. For that we don't even have to run an extra server like Tornado. It can be run in the single process Django server that is currently running. But it have some problem like WebSockets or long polling require a live connection. So at a time your app must be running like 4 or 5 threads. So only 4 or 5 clients can be connected at a time, not more than that. So you might be thinking we can use G-Event also for that. It can scale a little bit more. But G-Event also have its own problems. Like Psychopg drivers are not green thread safe, and debugging the G-Event threads is a whole lot of mess. So you will not find easily the deadlock situation that will arrive in your application. So the tools we have left with are running another server which can scale to tens of thousands of connections at a time that our clients will be connected to. So we have I think 2 servers that support this. The first one is Tornado and the second one is Twisted. So Twisted is a more low-level coding, so you can also use that, but I chose Tornado over that. So these are the advantages of Tornado. Tornado is a framework asynchronous networking library which can scale up to tens of thousands of connections at a time. So it makes it ideal for long polling, WebSockets and other applications that require long-lived connections. So next I have used the SockJS library. We can also build the WebSocket part in JavaScript, and JavaScript already supports it. We can also make that in Python by ourselves, but we have to support the back support all the browser also. So SockJS is a library that provides JavaScript library and the Tornado or Python client to handle all the things. So SockJS, what SockJS do is it first connect with the WebSocket. If that connection fails, then it will move to long polling. If that fails, then it will move to Comet. So it will support all the connection that we require, all the browsers that we have to support. And the last one is ZMQ. ZMQ is a messaging library, asynchronous messaging library. It's just I need to connect to third-party applications. So I use this as it is supported very well with C++ and Java APIs also. So it doesn't have to do much. But if you don't require, you can also use Redis PubSub or other queuing library like ActiveMQ instead of this. So here is some sample code. On Tornado, we just have to inherit the class of SockJS connection, and we just override some three methods that SockJS gives us: on open, on message and on close. As all the three methods self-explaining, on open will be called when the connection from the browser is open. So we can we can modify or override according to our app. On message will be called when the browser sends us a message, and on close will be when the connection to the browser is closed. And you will find the same code for JavaScript. It also have same on open, on message and on close. So SockJS automatically handles all the method. We don't have to implement the low level for connecting the WebSockets. So first I'll show you the demo of the application. So I have run the Django server here. And here I run the Tornado, as you can see, and here is a third-party API. I have built the mock server for pushing the data to show the demo app, but you can that push server is not required for our application. It will be anything for third-party API, or Django or Celery will be acting as the third server. So let's refresh this. So this is the application running, and here is the as you can see, the first message is shown is socket open. So whenever I have applied the console log, so you can see whenever browser sends a request to the server, it will receive the on open message, and on the Tornado you can also see it will also show the client connected also. You can see that the connection opened on the right side. And you are seeing that our third server, push server, is sending the data that is received by Tornado using ZMQ, and that data will be pushed to the browser that you are seeing right here. So my current application is just updating all the rows and getting the data like a stock exchange data or market data you receive. Any questions till now?
So how is the browser talking to Django also?
That is a simple HTTP connection that Django currently uses.
Different URL when you want.
Right. So currently I have provided the URL of Tornado server through the Django and the port number also. But in the production I have run both of the things behind the HAProxy. And all the Tornado request goes to the same domain with a /socket path. And on HAProxy I just differentiated the /socket request all to the Tornado. Any other question? Okay.
Okay, done. I have another.
Okay.
Have you looked at Django WebSocket pretest?
Yeah, I have looked at it, but some of the I recently looked at it, but doesn't seems to solve a lot of problems. Uh, and वैसे right now Django channels is also coming. It's in beta stage, but we can also use that. It's just the architecture that I have used in my last company, so I'm just using that. I didn't remember,
You're
but
also running Tornado, which comes with its own set of
which comes?
with its own set of whatever, meaning it adds edits to it, right?
Kind of. I didn't realize any.
Okay, when it will run.
It's not that complicated when I use it. So I'll show you the code. It's really easy to set up a Tornado. If you know any drawbacks of Tornado, you can tell me. So here is the code directory. You can see the socket server API.py is the file. That is our Tornado socket, server file. And everything else is a Django app. And I'll show you the socket. So here is our starting module, data processing, in which I am setting a dictionary. Listener is just a dictionary which will store all the client's current live connections. So whenever a client connected from the browser, its WebSocket URL or request URL will be saved in that listener for future sending the data to the client. And here I have started a thread for ZMQ socket that will listen all the time to the ZMQ third-party API server. And here are the simple methods just to start. Tornado server is started by this command, just IO loop instance of start, and it can be stopped with a stop method. So I just created a class for defining these methods, and I call these methods by making an instance. Web data is the instance of data processing, and I'll just webdata.start Tornado server will start the Tornado server. So my initialization script will start our ZMQ socket thread. Here's the thread. So in this, I am just running a ZMQ socket in a thread. So you can easily find the how to connect with ZMQ on its documentation site. So I'll just follow that. I created a TCP connection to the URL that third-party API provided. So not third-party API, I am just listening to that port, and third-party API will push all the data to our socket server. So either Django or Celery wants to connect, it can just make a ZMQ connection and push the data to our listening port, that is 26016. And here is the while loop that is running our listener. So whenever it receives a message from the socket, it just passes that and pass it to the apply async send message to the browser. So this function, what it do is it just sends the data to the browser. So whenever I receive the message, I just search that client ID that I received from them in the message. I just either you can search that client ID in your message and send particular data to that client ID, or you can broadcast to all of them. Like I am broadcasting whatever message I am receiving, I am broadcasting all the clients. So I'll just loop over the listeners and get its request that we have saved sock.js instance, and I'll just send the request.send. I'll just send the data. So front end will receive that data, which can be used or update in the notification form using JavaScript or jQuery. Any questions?
What were your performance numbers? How many connections it can handle?
because I use socket.io and RabbitMQ instead of that ZMQ.
Okay.
So the problem was that it was not scalable.
Uh,
So what were your numbers?
I didn't actually benchmark it, but currently in production that I used, where I have used that architecture, it is running fine and it have around 2 to 3,000 clients generally connects to it at a time. So it works fine with all of those clients. Any other question? I have not implemented security in that, but you can implement that authentication layer in the Echo WebSocket. So, as you can see, the front end on the JavaScript side, I send whenever I connect to the server, I send an add message. The add message, I separate that message. If the message is add, I'll just add that to listener dictionary. So you can implement your authentication layer over there. You can set up an Django instance here or use the session middleware that you can send from the JavaScript library to manage the authentication on the socket side also. Any other question? Okay, so that's it from my side. If you want to ask anything else, otherwise I'll just stop this talk.
So it was a great talk. So thanks, man. Python in education. In our panel we'll have Dr. Ajit Kumar, Gora Mohanty, Professor Kannan, Satyakam Goswami, and Sirtaj. It will be up here. For the topic, which is Python in education, so we have Dr. Gora Mohanty. Just to give you a brief introduction about all of them. So Gora Mohanty is an astrophysicist by training. He has been involved with software for more than 2 decades. Apart from consulting technology startup, he has been closely involved in localizing Linux in Indian languages, especially Oriya. Sirtaj Singh. Sirtaj is no longer a stranger for people coming from KDE world, a KDE developer. Sirtaj also has had his stint with entrepreneurship when he managed technology for empowered mobile systems. Dr. Kannan, as most of you might have attended his talk also, that he's a professor at chemistry at Department of IIT Bombay. Professor Kannan's research interests are in control system and he has written a book on digital control. He currently manages MHRD's spoken tutorial project. Satyakam Goswami. Satyakam has been involved with free software for more than a decade now. He's a hustler who has been involved in various projects like FOSS events, PyChill, FOSS Yatra, and he has also been my mentor. So I would like you guys to give a warm welcome to all our panelists over here. So the topic, as we can see, is Python in education. So
hi everyone. Let's first of all, I'll like Adit, mics with you guys. Huh? Okay. So considering there are 2 faces there, so that's going to come up sometime. So first of all, why don't you guys talk about your introduction to Python, how it kind of came about, and how did you, considering its education, educate us on how you guys discovered Python.
Speaking for myself, I guess, because I was never involved in like teaching computer science or anything. So using Python was just because we always used to need, even as a physicist, you always need to know some programming to do data analysis, to do instrumentation and all. So we used to use C, then C++. I never got into Java, but then Python, because it's so simple and and what I find is it's very easy to read other people's code, which is a big advantage when it comes to it, because most of the code that you work with is actually comes from other people. So it's easy to read it and understand it than having to think about, okay, why was this done in this kind of a way? So that's one.
So what you want to know is how we got into Python. So I was trapped by somebody into Python. So what happened is, I started coding first in Fortran, that was in 85, started in 87, switched over to C, and using it mostly for the accelerator control systems that I used. And in around 2004, started a project for making small equipment, lab equipment for teaching science, mainly physics. So there was a project called Phoenix project, and now there is a device called XPICE. You will find it on the website. So I wrote, since I knew C, started writing everything. It was in Linux. Wrote a device driver to communicate to hardware, and then some C programs like small oscilloscope and everything, and put it out as open hardware. So another person took it up. One person is a freelancer named Pramod. So he wrote whatever I wrote in C, in Python, called the same device driver, and published on Linux Gazette, online journal. So I got convinced that it was much easier to do the same in Python. So then at that point I was forced to learn Python. After that I have been sticking to Python, at least for that area. So that's about getting into Python, and now I am liking it because it substitutes many of the things done by MATLAB and other expensive software in a much more easier way, and that's about the first thing, how I got into that.
So actually I don't do Python programming, but my job is to make sure that Python is promoted. A large number of students are trained. The Python programmers in IIT get their salary in time. Make sure the government releases the money. So I always believe that we should not ask questions like, is Python better, Scilab better? In the morning there was a question, Python better or Ruby better? Python better, Scilab better or Octave better, stuff like that. Because depending on the situation, each one will be better. But on the other hand, because these are open source software, they can talk to each other. You can put them all together and come up with something very powerful, much more powerful than some of the commercial counterparts. Okay? In fact, we have trained through our spoken tutorial project about 30,000 students in Python across the country. Okay? In fact, this I proposed as an alternative to our contact, because in our project FOSSEE, I'm one of the PIs of the project. The main PI of the project, Prabhu Ramachandran, is the expert in Python. In fact, when Enthought started Enthought India, he was the India head for that. So he's a very, very good guy. He wrote Mayavi, for example. Used to go for contact programs, Python programs. Our staff members used to go. I'm sure Amit also would have gone to some of those contact programs. You go to some place, faraway place, 2 people, 3 people go there, and then sometimes they show interest. Some other times these people will come back and say nobody showed interest. I am really disappointed. So that kind of contact program would, you actually cannot train many people. You also don't have time. 2-3 people can go only to certain number of places. So we came up with a methodology that made sure that we could train something like 30,000 people. It could not have been possible by the conventional methods. So we are in the process of creating such methodologies for that. We are also this, not working. So the other thing is what Ankit presented in the morning, Yaksh, which is the online testing platform. Once again, that is going to be useful. If you want to go, let's say the MOOC way, you know, stuff like that, what are the modern ways of spreading things in a big way? Of course, one thing I'm really unhappy about is, you know, that CBSE at one time wanted to make Python mandatory for schools, okay, CBSE board. But there was a fear because the faculty members, the teachers knew only C, C++, they didn't want to, they were worried. So they convinced CBSE to say, make it optional. Make it optional, not many people learn. And now I hear some people saying that they are going to completely remove it. I don't know to what extent it is true. It will be a major step back. Major thing because one of the greatest things about some of the scripting languages is you don't have to worry about dimensioning, typing, and all kinds of things. And these are all vector arithmetic. You just operate as if they are, just as a mathematician will do, multiply A and B, and then A and B gives matrix A times vector B. These are created for mathematicians. You can also do low-level kind of calculations. You can also do computer interfacing, instrument interfacing, all kinds of things you can do in Python. It is sad that we are going away for CBSE because we could have influenced so many children. And if CBSE does, then every state board will start doing it. So that is where we lost out. So we were actually trying to see that whether our methodology can be transferred to them so that we could, in fact, we proposed, we will train all the CBSE teachers in 1 year. We can do that, right? But unfortunately, we are not heard. Okay? So I'm very disappointed, but we have a great tool in the form of Python, and I think we have come a long way from, let's say, Fortran. Yeah.
So I can vouch for the fact that there has been influence of projects like FOSSEE, and there are lots of people who come to me and say that, I learned Python from you. So there was someone at PyCon in India this time around who was speaking, who came to me and said that, you taught me Python. And there are a couple of people, when I started off with this, PyDelhi, a couple of people here who came up and said, hey, you know what, I discovered Python when you did this workshop. So at some level, yes, things are working. And so if we can bring, Python more and more in education, obviously the chances of it from, the next generation taking it on kind of is coming.
So for me, like both open source and Python, before saying that you walk this path for the others, like mine was a necessity, on the job you have to automate certain things and you have shell scripting things, but something like, you need to automate servers and all that. That is where I discovered the language. I knew about it, but again, on the job when you are there, you are you generally don't tend to learn new things because things are working, right? So that's where I discovered it, and then realized the power of it and started learning things. And then when I left the day job and all, then I started learning all the nitty-gritties of the web, of the things, the application side of things. So I'm more practical side of things, that's where I started and just got stuck to it. Yeah.
No, I became a Python programmer by mistake. What happened was, now this would have been about, I guess, 17 years ago. I was still working on KDE, which is all C++, and I was also working in Java professionally. And at the time I had been writing, I don't know how many of you may have used a program called Doxygen that's used to generate documentation for C++ programs. And this was before Doxygen. The tool that KD used to use to generate his documentation was something I had written in Perl. And so when I started in Java, my first thought, at that time this whole J2EE was all the rage, and my first thought when I became a Java programmer was, my God, how much of this code can be generated? All of it, like almost all of it. There's just, out of 10 lines of code, 9 of them can be generated, 1 of them written by hand. So what I'm going to do is write a program that generates most of my Java code. So for a while I did, and the language I picked to do that was Python, which I didn't know much of at the time, but I just knew that, well, it's simple. I can do string processing very easily in it. I can, read simple Java, parsing Java interface files and all was very easy. So initially, it was great. Like I was writing these massive projects, a whole lot of boilerplate code, generating it with Java. And I did this for about 6 months, and it was great because, I was very productive and a lot of stuff was going on. But then I realized at some point that I went, instead of writing Python code to generate this Java code, why don't I just write Python code? And so that was a kind of a career, let's say an inflection point for me, which happened around the year 2000. And so the next time after that, I stopped working on KDE because I realized I didn't want to do C++ anymore. I stopped working in Java because I didn't want to do Java anymore. So ever since then, I've been a Python programmer. So my life has never been the same after that, but it's been pretty good, so I'm pretty happy. That's my story. Yes. Laziness took me to Python.
That's always wisdom. So, considering that you're talking about considering that we are talking about education, and we have people from community and we have people from academics background, I would kind of like to understand what you guys think in terms of how community can engage with these projects like FOSSEE, such that you are ultimately able to ultimately taking them to the same goals.
Could you define the goals?
So the goals being that certain tools being used a lot. So essentially, the major goal with FOSSEE was to get people to use Python for doing scientific computing for their college courses rather than MATLAB. So those sorts of goals where you are actually trying to take people away from so take them to open source tools that they can use for their education purpose, like for their courses itself. So how do you think community can engage? So both,
You want to answer?
no, go ahead. So both an academician's perspective on it, and considering that you guys are from industry, how do you think industry can interact in that?
Yeah, see, actually, I think there are two parts to the question itself. Like, one is in education, for education, and in the industry, yeah, we ought to learn, right? That is also education. But the end goal is something like getting things done. In education, like we are trying to explain certain concepts in physics or scientific terminologies, right? So Python really makes it very easy with all the libraries and everything present. So I think that is where we have to differentiate between these 2 points. Like from my point of view, like I know this is an end tool, again a tool to getting things done, and which again ultimately gets me paid, right?
More or less, my question is in terms of community engagement.
Yeah.
Like, how can, let's say, PyDeli help JNU, and how JNU can help PyDeli, both the ways?
See,
the goal of promoting Python in their courses.
In courses is again that there are two approaches which Professor Kannan has already tried to touch upon. Like there is a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach, right? So PyDeli, whatever is trying to do through Python Express, we go to all the missionary mode of going to colleges, 1 or 2 workshops here and there. See, all this is happening, right? So this is a very good thing which even people from the industry appreciate and give credit to. saying that, okay, now that PyDelhi is trying to do something like this, we get candidates while interviewing, which does not need at least the basic, the fundamentals of teaching of, like, let's say, how to use a virtual environment, or how to use PyPy. Otherwise, they have to go through this whole investment in time and energy and money and people to get them on the job productive. So this is something I think which already the community has demonstrated, and which is a bottom-up approach. In the top-down approach, like, I think the policies and everything, like, we have the open source policy, we have policies in the terms of saying that, okay, let's make this language the de facto one or the standard one because it's so easy to learn, or so that will come only when we have, again, there will be some chicken and egg problem, like there are not enough teachers. I have first-hand experienced this in my kids' school itself. We went to one of the summer training programs, so their teachers are learning in the same class as students because they themselves did not know. So I think that both the approaches we have to follow, and community, I think, is doing well, and they are creating enough buzz around it. That's what I feel. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to step back a little bit. First thing we need to do is define what you mean by the community. Okay, it's easy for us to talk about an organized, kind of an institution like FOSSEE and say, okay, well, how can we help FOSSEE specifically, right? Which is something I'll get to in a moment. But before that, the idea of saying community. Now, I'm coming at this from, I haven't been in academia for, almost 20 years now. So for me, the question is, why do I want to? What is it that, what do I hope to achieve? Forget about, from a lot of the people here, I'm sure, if ones of you are not students or professional Python developers, yeah, your question, before even answering the question that is asked here, is why are you asking me? Why should I, why should I waste my time? I've got things to do, if you can't even describe what I should do for you, tell me why. So the question is, what is it that you hope to get out of this? Now, I'll tell you from a personal perspective, what it means to be part of, now this discussion so far, at least this whole conference that I've been here, I've been to a lot of conferences of various types over the years, and the line between what you see as the more commercial ones and ones that are community driven like this one is pretty sharp. Even if the attendees themselves don't really recognize it. Now, what you guys have to realize is you are here as part of, whenever you sit down and start up a Python interpreter, you are using the result of the work of a community, right? Whether you like it or not, you are not simply Python consumers. You are part of something that has been created by people just like you. So it is in your interest to be part of both driving both the evolution and the continuity of the tools that you use if you have an interest in this industry on a long-term basis. Some of you are still students, right? The whole concept of being part of an open source community is still alien to you, and you still don't really understand what that means, or why you would want to do so. But that's a whole discussion that we can have at some point. But the main thing is that these tools are not just technology; they are the output of a process, a community, a group of people who are involved in the development and the manifestation of these software projects on an ongoing basis for whatever reasons, whether it's they get paid to do it, or they're interested in it, or because it's the side effect of some research that they're doing that's more or less unrelated to the actual programming itself, whatever. Each one of these tools is the result of people like you contributing into them. So even if you decide that educating people in Python is not what you necessarily want to do, or even you feel this is not your skill or whatever, and I'm sure even if it's not your skill, Sahir will be able to give you some idea of what you can do for an organization like FOSSEE if you so choose. It is, all of these projects are developed visibly now. I mean, it's easier now, it's so easy now for you guys to go on into GitHub and have a look and see people contributing, being part of a project rather than consumers of it, rather than just people submitting bug reports or whatever, right, or downloads. It is in your interest to, as both in your terms of the tool set that you have, the amount of skill that you have at your disposal as you grow as a programmer and a developer, the kind of capabilities that you will be able to market to people when you go out and say, give me a job because and you have open source stuff to show, or involvement with the community to show. And even this conference here that you are seeing, guys like Amit and Satyakam, Gora, all of these guys, they exist because of the community. Like, Gora has been part of not just the Python community here in Delhi, but the Linux community here in Delhi for coming up to 15 years now. So as a Satyakam, these guys, I think between the two of them, I think I'm number 3 oldest, probably Linux Delhi guy here on stage. Number 1 is probably over there, Tarun. So what I'm saying is that if this was a Microsoft thing, this discussion would probably not even be happening, right? It would be in Microsoft's business to spend $200 million to make sure that every university and college is out there, learning. All the teachers are learning their software, their tools and software. It's only because this is a community effort that this discussion here is even relevant and possible and necessary. So all I'm saying to you in this huge lecture of mine is, first of all, look at this, look at Python, look at the projects that you use, look at the people here as part of your community, part of things that you own. They are your tools, your projects, your things that you can drive both the direction, development, and evolution of. And you are more than just a consumer, you are part of it. And it's to your interest in making sure that the things that you spent all this time and money and effort in get better and are more widely involved, more widely used. So yeah, get in there. Just when they tell you, this is how you can help us, think about why you want to do it, and these are the reasons why you might want to. Anyway, sorry about that.
So your question was, how can community participate and academia, and in fact you mentioned FOSSEE also. So I want to give 2 or 3 examples and then explain what I have in mind. Although we have spoken tutorials on Python, basic Python training can be imparted through that, good enough. But we have nothing on Django. Okay. Now why it is important? Because my website itself is on Django and it is kind of broken, and I'm trying to fix it. And I'm looking for Python experts, I'm looking for Django, people who know Django, either part-time, full-time, whatever, things like that. What is interesting is, this is where community can actually help. What is interesting is, I experienced the same thing on Scilab. One prof from some engineering college called me and said, you have Scilab spoken tutorials, but you have only the basic level. What about advanced level? I said, look, we don't have the bandwidth to create the advanced level. Okay? If you just do a Google search, you will get all the PDF documents that tell you how to do it. Go on. If you know the basic level, you can do it yourself. He said, no, our students want to learn only from videos. They don't want to they don't want to see PDF. I mean, this is one of the side effects of, video age. Okay? So, now I have this question. We need Django spoken tutorials. We don't have the bandwidth. Community can create. And not only that, I don't know how many of you, I told the other day, last week when I came here, to create a 10-minute spoken tutorial, we pay 10,000 rupees on Rorium from the government funding. We also give a certificate, you can give a link to anybody who wants to hire you. So it's a great thing, okay? So community can help. Community can guide some people, can do that. And it will also produce, the moment you create one, some 1,000 people will benefit by that. So it has a cascading effect. The second thing that I wanted to point out was, in fact, there were two college teachers, I don't see them now. They came from Maitreyi College because they have made Scilab compulsory in physics, all BSc physics. There are 35 colleges here. That means we are talking about 2,000 students who have to study Scilab every year. I am very happy because they could have said MATLAB. Okay, I am very happy because they chose Scilab. It is an open source. For me, it doesn't matter whether it is Ruby or Perl or Python, or because I look at it as from the angle of what is good for the country, what is good for the IT sector, what is good for the students. At the minimum, the open source things will talk to each other, and you can put things together, make them work. So here, once again, we are trying to see, we are sitting in Bombay, how do we get this thing going? There are 2,000 people who are to be trained, and they're teachers. And year after year, there will be 2,000 students. If physics does it, tomorrow it will be mathematics, and then chemistry, engineering. How are we going to support this? So we need actually something. So I'm giving Scilab as an example. Okay, last example. We are in the process of getting a big project from Ministry of Culture to put up a portal. Okay, and we are thinking of doing this through Drupal. Through Drupal, because it is something that every library can actually manage. And of course, specific applications could be in different languages. It could be in Python, it could be in Django, whatever. I mean, all that, it could be in Java. You create them, plug them in. This is just a integrated thing. So one of the things that we had a big Drupal conference recently in Bombay about 2 weeks ago. DrupalCon Asia was held first time in India, and Dries came. One of the things he proposed is how to get the community to participate in a big project like this, right? Because why I am saying this, the same thing could have been done using Django instead of Drupal, right? But then we don't have enough people. We have 1 million sites on Drupal. If you have enough people who know Django, you will have more websites. There is a shortage, so people don't want to touch it. They'll get into difficulty. So here, Dries proposed that there will be a credit scheme. So here is a topic to be done. It's out in the open to the community. So now there are actually 3 players. One is the agency that starts. It says, supposing I say, this is the module to be created for Drupal for our project. So I propose it. And there is a company for which takes this order, does it for money. Okay, this is the second one. And there is an employee of that company who does that. So there are 3 players. So he says all 3 players should be given credit. So if that employee, wherever he or she goes, will retain the credit. Okay, it will appear in the Drupal page saying that that fellow did this. How did they do it? How many commits he made? What are the things he did? So here is another example of course, the moment we start doing this, you see the community taking ownership of modules and saying that we will do it. Who made it? X. Okay, is he getting a job? Of course he is getting a job because he is known all over the world. And for the government, for example, it becomes very easy to fund such projects because after sales support is there, because somebody says I want to use it. Somebody who says I'm going to develop this module will say I will support it, I took some money, I maintained it, but I'm going to use it for something else also because it's open source. Right? Now this kind of thing cannot happen in a commercial setting. Commercial setting means proprietary software. It can happen only in open source software. It's a fantastic thing, all of you. And of course, if you want to talk about open source versus non-open source, for our country, open source is the best. By the way, how many of you want to become entrepreneurs? Yeah. So, I think some people are sleeping after lunch. I'm sure generally there are more people who are interested. Yeah, everyone. There is nothing, there is no alternative to open source. Otherwise you have to invest. Initial investment. Where are you going to get it? You can do the same thing. I mean, look at this computational fluid dynamics. You have this Fluent, very powerful, very strong. But look at OpenFOAM. You can do the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Actually, you can do a lot more. But how many people know OpenFOAM?
So, I have an example from the industry. So, we developed an open source software for cloud computing for managing VMs. And we took the base of an open source software for that. Yeah. So we developed a cloud computing software, and we took the base of an open source software for that, and completely modified the open source software, made a lot of proprietary changes to that, which we did not contribute back to the main line of the open source code base. So what we found after 2 years was that we were far behind the community in terms of functionality and features, and eventually we had to junk our entire project. And now our new approach is that whatever we write, we need to contribute it back to the open source, otherwise it is going to die. So that is the learning from the commercial side of things as well.
Right. Thank you. So the 2 points that I gather majorly. The one, as Siddharth said, essentially there's always a feedback loop. That once something happens, there's a feedback loop that kind of, it's self-serving in some sense to do this just because of that feedback loop. And I think the other part, so it's interesting that you mentioned that you're using Django as well. So edX is, MIT's edX project is also on Django. So, I mean, essentially you have to use, education is also using ultimately those same tools that you're creating. So one way of contributing directly itself is to actually contribute to the tools that will ultimately be used by people. So I'll open, do you guys have anything to add?
I would like to add something which you are asking how the community can interact with the academic. So here, what I consider as one of the things now, so Kannan was telling that CBSE option of Python is now probably will vanish. This is an alarming signal. So what we should
worries, but I believe in God. Let's see.
So these past 2 years, I mean this PyCon and SciPy, which I regularly do, I have been proposing something, and at least some people were agreeing that like we should approach the +2 teachers, whatever school we have contacts, and we have to convince them the need of it. See, now they are teaching happily C++ and they don't see any need to switch over. And one reason is it is taught by computer science teachers and they don't have any difference between Python and C++. It's just a language. But if you talk to mathematics and physics teachers, there is a big application for Python. Whatever people were doing in MATLAB and all, paying a lot of money, Python does it well. So what I proposed that time was, we start writing code fragments covering the topics in 11th and 12th standard physics and mathematics. And I myself put a limit, no code should be more than 20 lines. And whatever I wrote, it is kept on the website. That Python for schools, it is there if you search Python and the digit 4, single word, Python for schools. And the idea was to generate a large pool of small code fragments. The 20-line limit is, I assume that anybody will be able to read 20 lines. If I make a 100-line thing, people will not read it. But the interesting thing what happened is, when I approached somebody I knew in NCERT, told, why don't get a sample, some teachers, we can have a first-hand interaction. So that happened last month. Some 10 teachers came. So the idea was, they put their problems. So they wanted, say, some LC circuit, how it will behave and all those simulations. So they gave it. Next day I gave him again 10 lines of code that will show all those things. But still, what they wanted was, instead of changing L or C, the time in the code, they wanted a slider or something. So that, but at least they are willing to do. So their problem is they are not quite capable of making what they want. So there are people looking for some support, and probably if we convince them the power of Python in teaching science and mathematics, probably they will influence their schools, and at least we can
tip the scale in favor of Python at least.
So, I remember Satya was running this thing called PyChill, which was essentially for students who were in school. So maybe rather than just students, we should probably get in touch with the physics and maths teachers in schools as well and promote PyChill among them.
C++ and all that also that.
So even the C++ what they teach is outdated. They use the turbo C script and is that how? Is it okay? So we have to speak loud. So this turbo C also is not ANSYS standard, and so that also is something which spoken tutorial, I think.
Spoken tutorial can take care of, like, maybe create some tutorials in GCC and things like that. And PyChill basically was an experiment in we did one in IIC using open data. So similar lines we did that. So yeah, the response was very good, and people created their own website.
So this is probably one place where community running PyChill and we trying to interact with NCRT schools as well can go together and try and promote.
Yeah.
I have a couple of comments. Sorry, you wanted to say? Okay. I have a couple of comments. One is that DAV schools are apparently training on Python. In fact, our college remote center in Chhattisgarh has been conducting this. So it will be useful if the community can get it, because DAV headquarters must be here in Delhi somewhere. So that is something. DAV also has many schools. Apparently their entire system has maybe 1,000, close to 1,000. It is something that community can really participate. The other thing that you talked about GCC, our C training on C is the biggest training that we conduct through spoken tutorials. We have trained more than 2 lakh students in the last 4 years, and they necessarily have to use GCC. Necessarily. So we are kind of weaning them away from Turbo C, Borland C, and so on. So we are already doing that. So I think, so that is where once again the community can play a big role to say that let's use this package, let us use this language, let us use this approach, and it's going to be there for 10 years, 20 years, and set it up.
One quick question, since I'm going to ask a question now, is that I'm going to speak again on behalf of the audience and ask, as coming from industry, you guys, everyone here has been involved in training people in Python at some point. As a person who's not necessarily a person who's got a background in teaching of any kind, it's difficult for me to say, okay, I've got 5 hours a week or whatever, I want to help in people learning Python. What can I do? It's difficult for me to you're saying go and teach at schools. How? I mean, I don't know how. What am I going to go up to the nearest school and say, hi, I'm going to teach Python now. So in your estimation, in what way can a person like me get involved at these kind of levels? Is there institutional support? Is there some kind of structure? What is the way I can get involved?
So I think people are there, there's one sitting there right here, GT Rao. He is an excellent guy. I found him again because of community. So he needs content. I think you sitting at anywhere in a corner of the world. I think creating the content itself through spoken tutorial or otherwise, I think it will be a great contribution. As a computer science graduate, he's not but. He can go and deliver, so I think that could be a good contribution from your side, instead of optimizing on your time. That's what I say.
Spoken tutorials, create spoken tutorials, help college students create spoken tutorials. We pay them anyway, and that can be used in a big way.
So Gaurav, So you've been involved a lot in localization as well. Do you think localization in some way can also help with the whole effort of spoken tutorial? I mean, I think spoken tutorial has a localization bit to it as well, that they create courses that are, how do you think localization can help with that?
We kind of get away from the topic, I guess, but yeah, localization can surely help, but at least personally, localization what level I would say. Say if the interface, the IDE that you're going to use, yes, there it will help. I'm not actually in favor of what other people, some people have been trying to do is localize like language keywords and all. I don't think there is at the moment enough of a call to do that. I think that just creates confusion. But localization in terms of localizing the interface, the IDE, so that they can program without having to learn English, yes. Yeah, so a couple of the points I wanted to add to what various people have been saying. I think, as Hartaj I think brought up and other people said, it's difficult for a community person to have access. So what FOSSEE does, for example, what JNU probably has, is a structure, is a way that they can go out, interact with colleges, and there's a mechanism also for the colleges. It's easier for the colleges to come to JNU, say for example, or to FOSSEE, rather than whom are they going to call in the community and all. How are they going to even know that such a thing exists? So I think what the community can do is plug into the structure that these people like JNU can provide. So if JNU can say run a course for Python, so there will be instructors from the community who can come and there will be people from the community who can come and act as instructors in the community in such a course. The other point I'd like to add, I've seen this over and over again. Most recently now, there is a big fad that everybody should learn programming, which again I disagree with. But anyway, the Air Force, Indian Air Force asked people of my age, one of them was my cousin who's in the who have never done programming in their life, you have to learn programming. You have to do it's a 6-month course. And guess what the language of instruction was? It was Java. Just the syntax of it will probably take you 6 months to learn. And see, this also happens in college. There's a final year project which you have to deliver. Sometimes the requirements are quite ridiculous. It's a 1 month long project. One of the projects was, for example, completely designed from scratch game that plays chess, including a GUI with the chess pieces and all. Even I couldn't do that in a month. So, but the student submitted a program, and all of us know how he submitted the program. We paid somebody else to do it, and it was very proudly presented. Look what our students are capable of. So, coming back to my point, if you do have to learn, Python is a language where the syntax doesn't get into the way of learning programming. What you want to learn is how to think like a programmer. Here is your problem. How do I break it down into steps? How do I translate that into a line of code? To do that in Java would probably take you 10 times as long. And Java has its own advantage. I think that's not. But Java isn't a pedagogical language. It's not a language where you can easily learn how to program. That's the other point I think is in favor of languages like Python.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that whether you like an introduction to Python or programming at a certain point. There's something that I always wonder about. So there's this whole thing that I think private schools in Chicago now, public schools in Chicago now teach Python, whereas at one level there are also schools that say that they do not introduce people to computers till they are age 16. So, I mean, skill development is essentially about both the things. Like you need to understand the tools, but you also need to understand the concepts. So I kind of would want to have a discussion on the whole idea of how to manage this possibility of an overexposure to how do you manage skill development where you're teaching the tool and also you're teaching the concept at the same time. So something of a pet peeve of mine. So go along with that, and then I think people in the audience will want to ask questions.
Yeah.
I can respond.